During the blizzard, Ranger vanished into the dark and came back leading Walter toward a stranded truck buried in snow. Snow hammered the side of the old jail, so hard the windows rattled in their frames. Walter could barely see past the flashlight beam when Ranger suddenly bolted into the storm. The German Shepherd disappeared beyond the fence line without a sound. Then, somewhere out near the ridge road, Walter heard metal creak and a child crying through the wind. He grabbed his coat and followed the dog into the dark. Would you have gone after Ranger that night? Walter Hayes got fired on a Tuesday morning while the snow came down sideways across the loading yard. The new manager did not look him in the eye when he said it. He kept staring at a clipboard instead, tapping a pen against the paper, like he wanted the conversation over before it started. "We're automating the back warehouse next month," he said. "Corporate's cutting maintenance." Walter stood there in his canvas work jacket, with sawdust still clinging to the sleeves. 78 years old. 40 years fixing things that broke before younger men even noticed they were broken. "You got my last check?" he asked. The manager nodded too fast. "That'll be mailed." Walter gave a slow nod of his own. Then he picked up his dented thermos from the bench and walked out without another word. No speech, no anger. Just cold air hitting his face the second the warehouse door opened. Ranger waited in the truck. The old German Shepherd lifted his head the moment Walter approached. One ear bent slightly from an injury years ago. Gray spreading around his muzzle. Smart brown eyes tracking Walter's face carefully. Walter opened the passenger door. "Well," he muttered, climbing behind the wheel. "Guess it's just us now." Ranger pushed his nose against Walter's arm once before settling back into the seat. The heater in the truck barely worked. By the time they reached the trailer park outside Cedar Creek, Walter's fingers ached from the cold. His landlord was already waiting. That told Walter everything before the man even spoke. "Marty," Walter said quietly, "I'm 3 days late, not 3 months." Marty shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets. "I know, but winter rates went up. Utilities, too." Walter looked past him toward the trailer. Rust stains under the windows. A sagging porch step he'd fixed himself last fall. It wasn't much, still felt like home. "I can pay part today," Walter said. "Rest after the VA check clears." Marty glanced toward Ranger sitting inside the truck. "You know I've been fair with you. You have. But if I let one person slide, everybody wants the same deal." Walter stared at the frozen gravel between them. "How long?" Marty exhaled hard through his nose. "By Friday." "Friday, 3 days." Walter nodded once like a man discussing the weather. That night he sat at the small kitchen table inside the trailer with a yellow legal pad and an old calculator. VA benefits, truck gas, dog food, medicine for his blood pressure. The numbers did not work. He ran them 3 times anyway. Ranger lay beneath the table, one paw resting across Walter's boot. Around midnight, Walter heard coyotes somewhere beyond the highway. Ranger's ears twitched, but he didn't move. "You got more sense than me," Walter murmured. Friday came fast. The shelter in Billings had 1 empty bed left. "No dogs," the woman behind the desk said apologetically. "County policy." Walter stood there, holding Ranger's leash while wet snow melted off his boots onto the tile floor. "He's trained," Walter said. "Doesn't bark, doesn't bite. I'm sorry." "He stays in the truck then." "Sir, temperatures are dropping below 10 tonight." Walter looked down at Ranger. The dog leaned calmly against his leg. The woman lowered her voice. "There's an animal intake 2 counties south. They could probably take him until you get back on your feet." Walter's jaw tightened. Ranger had come in from a rescue program for retired service dogs 6 years earlier. Somebody had dumped him after the handler died. Walter remembered the first night the dog slept in his house. Ranger woke screaming from a nightmare so violently he crashed into the coffee table trying to stand. Walter understood that kind of sleep. "No," he said quietly. "He stays with me." The woman looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't. Outside, the wind cut through Walter's jacket like a blade. He sat in the truck for nearly 20 minutes without turning the key. Finally, he drove. No destination. Just road. Cedar Creek disappeared behind them beneath low gray clouds and blowing snow. Miles of frozen pasture rolled past the windows. Fence posts bent crooked under ice. Near sunset, Walter stopped at a gas station outside Hadley Ridge. For coffee he could barely afford. That was where he heard about the jail. Two men in hunting caps were talking near the register. "County still trying to dump that old place? $6 now, I heard. Nobody wants it. Costs more to tear down than it's worth." Walter carried his coffee over slowly. "What place?" he asked. The older man squinted at him. "Old county jail east of here. Been empty 20 years. Still standing, barely." The second man laughed. "Roof leaks. Pipes are shot. Whole place smells like dead raccoons." Walter stared out the window at the darkening highway. How far? Couple miles off Hadley Ridge Road. The county clerk looked surprised the next morning when Walter walked into the office. "You're serious?" she asked. Walter slid 6 wrinkled $1 bills across the counter. "That enough?" She blinked twice before taking them. "It's classified as abandoned county surplus property," she explained. "No utilities guaranteed. No liability coverage you'd be responsible for." "I understand." Truth was, he only understood one thing. It had walls. The road to the jail narrowed into cracked pavement and then gravel. Snow drifted against broken fence lines. Pine trees crowded the hills on both sides. The building appeared suddenly around a bend. Gray stone, rusted bars, 2 stories sitting alone against the mountains, like something forgotten on purpose. Walter shut off the truck engine. For a long moment, neither he nor Ranger moved. Then Ranger stood abruptly. Low growl, not fear. Focus. The dog stared toward the section of the building. "You smell something?" Ranger whined softly. Walter stepped out into ankle-deep snow. The wind carried the sharp scent of rust, wet stone, and old wood rot. The front gate hung crooked on one hinge. One shove opened it with a scream of metal. Inside, the air was colder somehow. Long corridor, peeling paint, rows of barred cells disappearing into darkness. Walter's boots echoed against concrete. Ranger stayed close to his leg at first. Then the dog suddenly pulled ahead, straight toward the back hallway. "Ranger." The dog stopped, but kept staring down the corridor. Walter followed the direction of his gaze. Heavy steel door at the far end. Chain wrapped through the handles, dust everywhere except near the threshold. Strange. Walter felt the back of his neck tighten. He turned away from it. Later. By nightfall, he'd cleared one small cell near the entrance. Swept broken glass aside with an old push broom he found in a storage closet. Used flattened cardboard for insulation beneath his sleeping bag. The temperature dropped fast after dark. Wind hissed through cracks in the windows. Walter removed his heavy coat and wedged it across the worst opening to block the draft. "Luxury accommodations," he muttered. Ranger circled twice on the concrete floor before lying directly across the cell doorway. Guard position, always facing outward. Walter noticed it but said nothing. Some habits stayed buried deep. He closed his eyes eventually, not sleeping, just resting. Around midnight, Ranger's growl ripped through the darkness. Low, sharp. Walter sat upright instantly, pulse hammering. The dog stood rigid at the cell entrance, staring down the corridor toward the chained steel door at the far end of the jail. Walter listened carefully. At first, he heard only wind. Then, a metallic sound, very soft, like something moving in the dark beyond the locked door. And Walter knew with absolute certainty that building was supposed to be empty. Ranger's growl deepened. Not loud, worse than loud, controlled. Walter pushed himself up from the sleeping bag, knees stiff from the cold concrete. His hand moved automatically toward the flashlight beside him before his brain caught up. Old habits. Always know where your light is. The corridor beyond the cell looked different at night. Longer somehow. Shadows stacked between the bars in hard black lines. The sound came again. Metal brushing metal. Very soft. Walter clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through drifting dust and landed on the chained door at the far end of the hall. Still closed. Still chained. Ranger didn't move. Walter swallowed once. Probably raccoons. The dog kept staring. Walter had heard raccoons before. Coyotes too, loose pipes, wind rattling old buildings. He knew the sounds buildings made when they settled in winter. This wasn't settling. He stepped into the hallway, carefully, boots scraping concrete. Ranger stayed half a step ahead now, shoulders tight. The farther Walter walked down the corridor, the colder the air became. Not supernatural cold, just the kind that came from stone walls and no heat for 20 years. Still felt wrong. The flashlight found faded numbers painted above the cells, old peeling white paint over rusted steel. C1, C2, C3, cell block C. Walter stopped 6 feet from the chained door. Dust covered everything except the narrow strip directly beneath it. Like something had moved through there recently. He crouched slowly, shining the beam lower. Mouse tracks. That was all. Tiny claw prints in the dirt. Walter let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "See?" he muttered toward Ranger. "Mice." Ranger gave one low huff but didn't look convinced. Walter reached out and touched the chain. Ice cold against his fingers. The padlock had rusted nearly solid. He rattled it once. The noise exploded through the hallway, so sharply, Walter flinched before he could stop himself. Instantly embarrassed. Nobody there but the dog. Still. His pulse was suddenly running too fast. For half a second, the hallway disappeared. Different walls, different metal door, red dust blowing across sandbags. Somewhere half a world away. Incoming alarms. A corporal yelling contact left. Walter blinked hard and the jail snapped back into focus. Ranger pressed against his leg immediately, grounding him. Walter rested one hand on the dog's neck until his breathing slowed again. "I'm all right," he said quietly. The dog stayed there another moment before stepping back. Walter returned to the front cell without opening the chained door. But he did not sleep much after that. Every tiny sound dragged him awake. Wind through broken windows. Pipes knocking somewhere deep in the walls. Ranger shifting position at the doorway. By dawn, Walter felt like he'd aged 5 more years overnight. Gray morning light filtered weakly through the cracked windows. Ranger finally relaxed enough to stretch across the floor while Walter dug through the storage closet near the entrance. The closet smelled like mildew and old oil. Most of the shelves had collapsed years ago. Rotten cardboard boxes slumped into piles of mush on the floor. But buried beneath a tarp, Walter found an old push broom, a rusted shovel, and a metal toolbox with one hinge broken clean off. Inside were 2 screwdrivers, a pipe wrench, and half a roll of electrical tape. Not much. Still felt like finding gold. "Well," Walter muttered, "we're moving up in the world." He spent the morning clearing debris from the first few cells. Broken glass, rotten mattresses, empty beer cans left by teenagers over the years. Ranger wandered constantly, sniffing corners, checking doorways. Twice he returned to the hallway leading toward cell block C. Twice Walter ignored it. Near noon, Walter found the old boiler room behind the processing desk. The oil heater looked ancient. Thick steel body, corroded pipes, dust packed into every vent. But intact. Maybe. Walter crouched beside it carefully. He'd repaired enough heating systems in his life to know the difference between dead and abandoned. This one looked abandoned. Different thing entirely. He spent nearly an hour checking lines and valves. One fuel pipe had cracked near the base connection. Another fitting leaked old black sludge when he nudged it. Dangerous, but maybe salvageable. "Don't get stupid," he muttered to himself. That was harder these days. Around mid-afternoon, Ranger barked sharply from down the hall. Walter followed the sound and found the dog pawing at an overturned filing cabinet near cell block C. The drawer had broken open. Papers spilled everywhere. Most were ruined from water damage, but one folder remained mostly dry beneath the others. Walter picked it up carefully. County Temporary Housing Initiative. Dated 1987. Inside were handwritten intake sheets, mostly men. Most listed as unemployed veterans. No dramatic secrets, no hidden government files, just names. Ages, notes about winter shelter. Walter stared at the pages a long time. One line caught his eye. Former Army mechanic, sleeps poorly. Requests, bed near exit. Walter slowly sat down on the edge of the bunk frame beside him. Near exit. He understood that one. Ranger nosed deeper into the cabinet and pulled something loose beneath the papers. A chain dropped onto the floor with a metallic clink. Dog tags. Walter froze. The sound hit him like a punch to the chest. Metal against concrete. Memory rushed in hard and ugly. Dark transport truck. Rain hammering steel. Someone screaming for a medic. Walter's breathing shortened instantly. Ranger was beside him before he even realized he'd started shaking. The dog pressed against his knees firmly. Solid weight. Solid warmth. Walter gripped the tags in one trembling hand until the flash passed. The name stamped into the metal had nearly worn away. Just enough left to read the first name. Ray, that was all. Walter closed his fist around the tags. "Somebody forgot you here," he whispered. By evening, the temperature inside the jail had dropped again. Walter decided to risk the heater. Carefully. Very carefully. He cleaned the vent line first, checked the cracked pipe twice, wrapped one leaking connection temporarily with old tape from the toolbox. Then he opened the oil valve a fraction. Nothing happened at first. Then came a deep cough from inside the unit. Ranger stood immediately. Easy. Walter tried the ignition switch. The heater roared alive all at once. Too loud. Flames burst suddenly through a split section of pipe near the base. Walter jerked backward fast enough to slam into the wall. "Damn it!" Ranger barked wildly. Walter grabbed the old shovel and smothered the fire with dirt and dust from the floor before it could spread. The flames died quickly, but smoke filled the room fast. Walter coughed hard, eyes watering. Ranger stayed beside him the entire time. When the smoke finally cleared, Walter sat heavily against the wall, breathing through the ache in his chest. "That could gone bad," he muttered. Ranger rested his head on Walter's knee. Outside, snow began falling again, heavy this time. Walter looked toward the dark hallway leading back to cell block C. The chained door waited there silently, and for the first time since arriving, Walter had the uneasy feeling the building was watching them back. The next morning, just after sunrise, Ranger lifted his head toward the front entrance. A vehicle was coming up the gravel road. Walter heard it a few seconds later. Old engine, slow tires crunching through snow. He stepped into the corridor as headlights swept across the broken front windows. A woman climbed out carrying a cardboard tray with 2 steaming coffee cups. She looked to be in her 60s, thick coat, work boots, gray hair tucked beneath a knit cap. She studied the jail for a long moment before spotting Walter in the doorway. Then she raised one coffee slightly and called out over the wind, "You really planning on living here through winter?" Walter stepped out onto the cracked concrete entrance with Ranger close beside him. "Wasn't planning on much of anything," he answered. The woman looked past him into the dim hallway of the jail. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she noticed the dog. Ranger watched her carefully, but didn't bark. "That your shepherd?" Walter nodded. "He's beautiful. He knows it." That got the smallest smile out of her. She held out one of the coffees. "Name's Ellie Boone. I own the grocery over in Cedar Creek." Walter hesitated before taking the cup. The heat felt almost painful against his frozen fingers. "Walter Hayes, I know who you are." Walter gave her a tired look. "That supposed to worry me?" In a town this size, everybody knows everybody after about 6 hours. She glanced up at the building again. "And people definitely notice when an old man buys a jail for $6. Walter snorted softly into the steam of the coffee. "Guess I overpaid." Ellie laughed once at that. It surprised him how long it had been since he'd heard laughter directed at him, instead of around him. The wind shifted hard across the ridge. Ellie zipped her coat higher. "Mind if I come inside before my eyelashes freeze together?" Walter stepped aside. The old jail looked worse in daylight with another person standing in it. Dust in the corners, water stains crawling down stone walls, the lingering smell of smoke from yesterday's heater incident. Ellie took it all in slowly. "You sleep in here last night?" "Sure did. You out of your damn mind?" "Probably." Ranger walked ahead of them down the corridor, nails clicking softly against concrete. Ellie watched him disappear around the corner. "He always patrol like that?" Walter looked down the hall. "Most nights." She handed him a paper sack she'd carried under one arm. Inside were canned beans, bread, 2 blankets, and a package of bacon. Walter frowned immediately. "I can't pay for this." "Good thing I didn't ask. I'm serious." "So am I." She leaned against the old processing desk and studied him for a moment. "You know what people in town are saying?" Walter took a slow sip of coffee. "Don't imagine it's flattering. They think you're either crazy or hiding from somebody. Maybe both. That's the spirit." Ranger suddenly stopped near the hallway leading toward cell block C. His posture changed instantly. Head low, ears forward. Walter noticed it right away. "So that's what you meant by patrol," Ellie murmured. Ranger stared down the hallway another few seconds before finally relaxing. Ellie lowered her voice. "Something back there? Old cells. That all?" Walter looked at the chained door barely visible in the distance. "Far as I know." He changed the subject before she could ask more. "You said you own the grocery. Boone Family Market. Been there 30 years. She glanced around again. "You got electricity?" "Some. Heat?" Walter said nothing. "That bad, huh?" "The heater tried to kill me yesterday." "All right, we're starting strong." For the next hour, Ellie helped him clear debris from the first floor. She didn't make a big show of helping either. Just picked up a broom and started sweeping broken glass into piles. Ranger followed both of them constantly. At one point, Ellie crouched beside him and scratched the loose fur around his neck. "You know," she said quietly, "people trust dogs more than people." Walter was dragging an old mattress toward the door. Can't blame them. By noon, the front corridor actually looked livable. Not good, but less abandoned. Sunlight pushed weakly through the broken windows. Dust drifted through the beams in slow silver streaks. Ellie stood with her hands on her hips. Still creepy. Luxury compared to the trailer I lost. The words came out before Walter meant them to. Ellie glanced toward him carefully, but didn't ask questions. He appreciated that. Instead, she pointed toward a warped wooden door hanging crooked near the entrance. That thing's about ready to fall off. Walter looked at it automatically. Carpenter brain. Even tired and hungry, he still noticed hinges before people. Bottom brackets split, he muttered. Frames warped from moisture. Ellie smiled slightly. So fix it. With what? She jingled keys in her pocket. I've got a hardware shelf in the back of the store full of stuff nobody buys anymore. Walter narrowed his eyes. You offering charity? I'm offering work. That sat better with him. An hour later, they drove into Cedar Creek together. Ranger rode in the truck bed beneath an old tarp, while snow flurries drifted across the highway. Cedar Creek was the kind of town people forgot existed unless they were born there. One main road, a diner, feed store, gas station, church with peeling white paint. Every head turned when Walter walked into Boone Family Market. He felt it immediately. Conversations lowering, eyes following him. A teenage cashier whispered something to another employee while glancing toward Ranger outside. Ellie noticed too. Ignore 'em, she said quietly. Walter shrugged like it didn't bother him. But it did. Always did. In the storage room behind the market, Ellie pointed toward a pile of leftover supplies. Old hinges, scrap plywood, boxes of mismatched screws. Take whatever helps. Walter picked through the pile carefully. Not greedy, never the greedy. He repaired the market's back door before sunset. Took him less than 40 minutes. Ellie tested it twice after he finished. Smooth as butter. Walter wiped sawdust from his hands. Door frame will need replacing by spring. You fixing that too? Depends if you keep feeding me coffee. That earned another laugh. When Walter returned to the jail that evening, Ranger jumped from the truck before the engine even shut off. The dog ran straight toward the back side of the property. Walter followed with a flashlight. Ranger. No response. Snow crunched under Walter's boots as he rounded the corner behind the jail. Ranger stood near the old exercise yard fence, growling softly at the ground. Walter swept the flashlight beam lower. The snow there had been disturbed. Not fresh footprints. Older than that. Like somebody had dug through the area weeks ago. Ranger started pawing furiously near a patch of frozen dirt beside the wall. Walter grabbed the rusted shovel leaning nearby and started digging. 6 inches down, the blade struck stone, then metal. A rusted fire ring emerged beneath the snow. Old burn pit. Walter crouched lower, brushing dirt aside with his gloves. Beer bottle caps, charred wood, and something else. Tiny carved initials scratched into the stone wall beside the pit. 3 letters. Walter stared at them silently. Not gang markings, not vandalism. Just somebody wanting proof they'd existed there once. Ranger sat beside him, watching the darkness beyond the fence line. The mountains had gone nearly black now. Wind moving through the pines with a low, hollow sound. Walter suddenly realized something. This place had not been empty for as long as people claimed. Maybe not physically, but somebody had kept coming back here. He looked toward the dark outline of the jail behind them, then toward the distant road disappearing into snow. For the first time since arriving, Walter had the uneasy feeling people in Cedar Creek knew more about this place than they were saying. And somewhere deep inside the building, metal clanged once again. Walter froze beside the burn pit. Ranger's ears snapped toward the jail instantly. The dog let out a low warning growl. Not fear. Recognition. Walter stared at the dark windows of the old building. while winds swept powder snow across the yard. Then the sound came again. Clang, sharp, hollow, brief. Walter tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Probably pipes," he muttered, but he didn't believe it. Ranger moved first, trotting quickly toward the side entrance of the jail. Walter followed slower. His knees ached worse in the cold now. Every stair and gravel path reminded him he wasn't 30 anymore. Hell, he wasn't 60 anymore either. Inside, the corridor felt darker than usual. The weak lantern near his sleeping cell barely pushed light past the bars. Ranger walked directly toward cell block C. Walter exhaled hard through his nose. You really got a thing for this hallway. The chained steel door waited at the end exactly where it always had. Still locked, still silent. Walter swept the flashlight around carefully. Nothing moved. No footprints except his own and the dog's. No broken windows. No animals. Then Ranger suddenly turned away from the door and trotted back toward the front entrance. Walter blinked. That's it? The dog looked back once, as if annoyed Walter hadn't figured something out. Then he laid down near the entrance cell again. Walter stood alone in the hallway another moment before finally giving up. The wind outside picked up hard after midnight. By 2 in the morning, the entire jail groaned beneath the storm. Walter barely slept. Every time the building shifted, his eyes snapped open. At one point, he woke already halfway standing, heart pounding, hand reaching for something that was no longer there. Rifle, radio, orders. Instead, there was only darkness and the sound of snow hammering old stone walls. Ranger immediately rose and pressed against him until Walter sat back down. "I'm good," Walter whispered. The dog stayed anyway. Near dawn, the power line outside finally failed. The weak light bulb over the corridor flickered twice and died. Silence swallowed the building after that. No hum, no buzz, just wind. Walter layered on both jackets and fed Ranger the last of the dry food from the bag Ellie had brought. "That's breakfast and dinner," he muttered. "So enjoy it." Ranger wagged once and ate slowly. Outside, snow buried the truck tires halfway to the rims. The storm had erased the road almost completely. Walter stood under the entrance awning, studying the sky, when Ranger suddenly stiffened beside him, then bolted straight into the snow. "Ranger!" The dog ignored him. Walter cursed under his breath and started after him immediately. Snow crunched deep beneath his boots. Wind burned his eyes. Ranger disappeared over the ridge near the old service road behind the jail. Walter's chest already hurt by the time he reached the top. Then he saw it. A pickup truck tilted crooked into a ditch about 50 yards ahead. Driver's side door hanging open. Hazard end lights dead. Ranger barked sharply near the front tire. Walter stumbled forward faster now. "Hello?" No answer. He reached the truck and looked inside. Woman, 30 maybe, curled against the steering wheel beneath a thin coat, and a child beside her. Boy, small, motionless beneath a blanket. Walter's stomach dropped hard. "Mom." The woman stirred weakly at the sound of his voice. Eyes glassy, confused. "We're okay," she whispered automatically. People said that, even when they clearly weren't. Walter checked the boy first. Cold skin, shallow breathing, still alive. Ranger pressed close against the passenger door, whining softly. Walter looked around at the whiteout swallowing the road behind them. No tow trucks coming. No emergency crews. Not in this weather. "What's your name?" Walter asked. The woman blinked slowly. "Clara. Boy's your son?" She nodded weakly. "Noah." Walter opened the passenger door fully. "Can he walk?" "I think so." Noah barely woke when Walter lifted him from the seat. The kid felt frighteningly light inside the soaked coat. Ranger stayed glued to Walter's side all the way back through the storm. By the time they reached the jail, Walter's breathing came rough and uneven. Clara nearly collapsed, stepping through the entrance. She stopped cold when she saw the cells. Fear flashed across her face instantly. "Oh God, it's not operating," Walter said quickly. "Just old rooms." She looked toward the bars and concrete walls, with panic rising behind her eyes. Ranger walked quietly over to Noah instead and rested beside him. The boy reached automatically into the dog's fur. That changed everything, just enough. Walter got the wood stove going using broken chair pieces and scraps from the storage closet. The heat came slowly, but it came. Clara sat wrapped in one of Ellie's blankets while Noah slept against Ranger's side on the floor. For a long time, nobody spoke. Finally, Clara stared into the fire and asked quietly, "You live here? For now." "Why?" Walter shrugged once. Couldn't afford anything prettier. That almost made her smile. Almost. Hours passed while the storm buried the world outside. Clara eventually warmed enough for her hands to stop shaking. Walter noticed bruising near her wrist when she reached for the coffee tin. Old yellow marks beneath newer purple ones, he noticed, pretended not to. "You heading somewhere?" he asked carefully. She stared at the mug in her hands, was trying to. "Family?" A long silence, then a small shake of her head. "No place left that feels safe." Walter nodded slowly like he understood more than he wanted to. Because he did. Noah woke near evening. His first words were directed at Ranger. "Can I pet him?" Walter looked toward the dog. "Depends what he thinks." Ranger lifted his head and walked over calmly. Noah buried both hands into the thick fur around his neck immediately. The boy smiled for the first time since arriving. Small thing. Still changed the room. That night the storm worsened again. Wind screamed through cracks in the upper windows, hard enough to rattle loose metal somewhere deeper in the jail. Clang. Clang. Clara looked up nervously. "What is that?" Walter poked the fire once with an iron rod. "Old building." But Ranger was already staring toward the dark hallway, leading back to cell block C again. Listening, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. Much later, after Noah had fallen asleep beside the stove, Walter stepped quietly into the corridor for air. Clara stood near the barred window at the end of the hall wrapped in a blanket. Snow blew sideways outside. "You saved us today," she said without turning around. Walter leaned against the cold stone wall. "No, dog did." She glanced back toward Ranger sleeping beside Noah. "He always this protective. Only when he thinks somebody's scared." Clara looked away again. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then very softly she said, "My boyfriend wasn't supposed to find us before spring." Walter's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, recognition. A certain tone people used when they'd spent too long surviving someone else. Outside, the storm kept hammering the mountain. Inside, the old jail held together one more night. And for the first time since Walter arrived there, the building no longer felt empty. Morning came gray and slow. The storm had buried the road almost completely. Snow pressed against the lower windows in white drifts, and the wind still hissed around the corners of the building like it wanted inside. Walter woke stiff beside the dying stove. Ranger was already awake. The dog sat near Noah's mattress watching the boy sleep. Clara noticed it too. "He stayed there all night," she said quietly. Walter rubbed one hand across his face. "He does what he wants." Ranger thumped his tail once against the floor without looking away from Noah. The kid looked better this morning, color back in his cheeks, breathing steady. Walter stood carefully, joints popping. "Coffee first," he muttered. "Best thing I've heard in 2 days," Clara said. The tiny kitchen setup near the processing desk barely deserved the name. One propane burner, a dented kettle, Canned food stacked beside intake forms from 30 years ago. Still worked. Walter handed Clara a chipped mug once the coffee was ready. She wrapped both hands around it like it might disappear. "You don't have to stay," Walter said after a while. Clara looked up sharply. "I know. The roads'll clear by tomorrow, probably." Another pause. "I know that too." But she didn't move. Neither did Noah. The boy sat on the floor beside Ranger, drawing shapes into the dust with a screwdriver he'd found somewhere. For the first time, Walter noticed how quiet kids got when they stopped feeling safe. That afternoon, the storm finally weakened enough for sunlight to break through the clouds in pale streaks. Walter spent most of the day working. That was how he handled things he couldn't fix emotionally. He fixed whatever sat in front of his hands instead. By noon, he'd removed the bars from one of the front cells. Not all of them, just enough to widen the entrance. Clara watched from across the hall. "What are you doing?" "Door. That used to be a jail cell." Walter wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Still is." He lifted a rough-cut plank into place. "But people sleep different when they can close something behind them." The words surprised even him. Clara looked down for a second, then nodded slowly. Walter worked until his shoulders burned. Using scrap wood from collapsed shelving and hinges Ellie had given him, he built a simple wooden door across the front of the cell. Nothing fancy. Rough edges, uneven stain, but solid. Most important thing, the lock worked from the inside. When Walter tested it, the latch clicked softly into place. Something about that sound changed the room. Clara noticed too. She stepped into the cell carefully that evening after Walter finished. Small mattress. Blankets folded at the foot. One lantern hanging from a nail. A door that closed. She rested her hand against the wood a long moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. Walter shrugged like it didn't matter. But it did. Later that night, headlights appeared outside the jail. Walter immediately stiffened. Old instinct. Unknown vehicle after dark. Ranger rose too. But instead of growling, the dog walked calmly toward the entrance. Interesting. Walter opened the door carefully. A battered blue pickup sat crooked in the snow. A younger man climbed out wearing a heavy flannel jacket and knit cap. Mid-40s maybe. Beard gone gray around the chin. He spotted Walter and lifted both hands slightly. "Easy," he called. "Ellie sent me." Walter stayed where he was. "What for?" The man glanced toward the dark building. "Said you needed electrical help before you accidentally burned the place down." Clara actually laughed softly behind Walter. First real laugh he'd heard from her. The stranger noticed Ranger sitting calmly beside him. "That dog likes me already," he said. "Dog's smarter than me then." The man walked closer carefully through the snow. Nate Collins. Walter shook his hand after a moment. Grip rough. Cold. Walter Hayes. Nate glanced up at the building. "Hell of a retirement property. Has potential." "Sure. If your dream home's a Depression-era prison." Ranger sniffed Nate's coat once, then leaned lightly against his leg. Nate smiled faintly. "Military dog? Rescue program. Figures." Walter caught it immediately. The stance. The haircut, trying not to look military anymore. The way Nate scanned windows before turning his back fully to the door. "You Army?" Walter asked. Nate nodded once. "Afghanistan." Walter grunted softly. Didn't ask more. Neither did Nate. That was the thing about veterans sometimes. The important conversations happened mostly through silence. Nate spent the next few hours checking old wiring near the boiler room. "Somebody patched this with extension cord at one point," he muttered. "That's exciting." Walter leaned against the wall. "Can you fix it?" "Temporarily." "Meaning?" "Meaning don't plug in a microwave and Christmas lights at the same time." Clara had started making soup from canned beans and bacon near the stove. The smell drifted through the corridor slowly. Nate noticed it instantly. "Please tell me that's for humans." "Depends how useful you are," Walter answered. By evening, the three adults sat near the stove, while Noah played cards on the floor beside Ranger. Snow tapped softly against the windows now, instead of screaming. For a little while, things almost felt normal. Then Nate noticed the dog tag sitting beside Walter's coffee mug. His expression changed slightly. "Who's Ray?" Walter looked down at the tags. "Don't know." "Found him here?" Walter nodded once. Nate leaned back in his chair. "This place gives me weird vibes. Thought electricians liked haunted buildings. I like buildings with paid invoices." Walter smirked faintly. Then Nate glanced toward the hallway, leading to cell block C. "You been back there?" "Little." "You should?" Walter's jaw tightened. "Question is whether I want to." The room grew quieter after that. Clara focused on stirring soup. Noah leaned against Ranger, half asleep. Finally, Nate looked toward Walter again. "You know what the hardest part was after I came home?" Walter didn't answer. Nate stared into the stove fire. "Everybody expected me to become normal again immediately." Walter let out a dry breath through his nose. "Yeah, but after a while." Nate shrugged. "You stop talking because nobody wants the real answer anyway." Walter looked at him carefully now. "You married?" "Was." That was enough information for one night. Hours later, after Noah and Clara had gone into the cell room Walter built, Nate helped him stack firewood near the entrance. "You planning on keeping people here?" Nate asked quietly. Walter frowned immediately. "No, you already are. That's temporary." Nate nodded slowly like he'd heard that word before. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. All three of them looked toward the dark hallway at the same time, clang metal striking somewhere deep in cell block C. Nate stared down the corridor. "Tell me that building settles weird." Walter grabbed the flashlight beside the stove. Ranger was already standing, watching the darkness, waiting. And this time Walter wasn't the only one who heard it. Nate slowly set down the piece of firewood in his hands. "That," he said quietly, "was definitely metal." The sound echoed again from somewhere deep beyond cell block C clang. Ranger stood perfectly still beside Walter, focused, alert. Walter grabbed the flashlight from the table near the stove. "You don't have to come." Nate pulled a smaller flashlight from his jacket pocket. That wasn't a suggestion. Clara stepped halfway out from the cell room. "What's happening?" Walter kept his eyes on the hallway. "Probably pipes." Nobody believed that anymore. "Lock the door behind you," Nate told her gently. Noah stirred beneath the blankets as Clara closed the wooden door Walter had built 2 days earlier. The latch clicked shut from the inside. Walter noticed the sound again. Safe. Different from prison locks. Ranger moved first down the corridor. The beam from Walter's flashlight shook slightly against the walls as they approached cell block C. Not fear exactly. Age. Cold. Memory. Walter hated how his body trembled now when adrenaline hit. The chained steel door stood motionless at the end of the hall. Nate crouched near it carefully. "Chain's old," he murmured. "Could've shifted." Then Ranger growled, low, immediate. Not at the door, at the floor. Walter swept the flashlight downward. A section of concrete near the wall had partially collapsed inward. Fresh cracks, fresh debris. Nate stepped closer. "Well, there's your ghost." Cold air drifted upward through the broken concrete. Walter frowned. "Basement? Maybe crawl space." Ranger pawed once at the edge before Walter pulled him back immediately. "Easy." The concrete groaned softly beneath Nate's boot. "Yeah, nobody steps there again." Back near the stove, Walter barely slept again. His brain stayed locked halfway between present and somewhere older. Every creak of the building sounded like movement. Every burst of wind sounded like distant artillery for half a second before reality corrected itself. Around 4 in the morning, Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee. That usually helped. Tonight it barely touched the edges of the noise in his head. By sunrise, the storm had finally broken. Clear blue sky over white mountains. Beautiful enough to hurt. Walter stood outside, drinking burnt coffee, while Nate checked the generator line near the service shed. The quiet lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then a county truck rolled slowly up the ridge road. Walter's stomach tightened instantly. Government vehicles rarely brought good news. A heavy-set man in an orange county jacket climbed out, holding a clipboard beneath one arm. He looked tired before he even spoke. "You Walter Hayes?" Walter nodded. The man glanced toward the building. "I'm Bill Mercer, County Property Office." Walter crossed his arms. "Something wrong with my $6 palace." Bill didn't smile. "We received a complaint." "About what?" "Lead occupancy." Walter looked toward the jail automatically. Nate came around the corner quietly listening. Bill flipped through paperwork. Property records still list this structure as condemned for residential use. Walter took the notice from him. Inspection required. 30 days. His jaw tightened slightly. "Who complained?" Bill shrugged. "Don't get names on these." "Somebody in Cedar Creek." "Probably." Nate muttered under his breath. Town gossip finally found a hobby. Bill looked uncomfortable now. "Listen, Mr. Hayes. Off the record?" He lowered his voice. "Most folks at the county don't care if one old veteran holes up out here with a dog. But once kids get involved..." His eyes drifted toward the building. "Different story." Walter looked back down at the paperwork. Fire exits, electrical compliance, heating systems, occupancy regulations. It may as well have been written in another language. "We don't have anywhere else," Clara said quietly from the doorway behind him. Bill noticed her for the first time. Then Noah, then Ranger, sitting between them all like security detail. Something softened briefly in his expression. Still didn't matter. Rules were rules. "You'll need inspections," Bill said. "At minimum, smoke detectors, secondary exits, safer heat sources. And that basement collapse needs evaluating immediately. Or," Bill hesitated, "or they shut it down." The county truck disappeared down the mountain an hour later. Nobody spoke much after that. Walter sat at the old processing desk studying the paperwork while Ranger rested beneath his chair. Nate leaned against the wall nearby. "You know he's right." Walter didn't answer. "This place needs work." "Yeah, I noticed. I'm serious, Walter, so am I." Silence stretched a moment. Then Nate walked over and tapped the inspection sheet. "You need wiring fixed properly. Emergency lighting. Carbon monoxide detectors." He pointed toward the stairwell. "And honestly, half those steps look one bad winter away from killing somebody." Walter hated hearing it because every word was true. The building had started feeling like shelter. That didn't make it safe. Clara quietly started cleaning near the kitchen while Noah drew pictures at the table beside the stove. Little houses, always houses. Walter noticed that too. "You should ask Ellie for help," Nate finally said. Walter shook his head immediately. "No. You'd rather lose the building. I'd rather not turn into a charity project." Nate laughed once without humor. "Brother, we passed that exit 5 miles ago." Walter's face hardened slightly. That old pride, the dangerous kind. Nate saw it instantly. "Look," he said more calmly, "nobody's asking you to beg. But this place isn't just yours anymore." Walter hated how much that sentence landed, because somehow, without meaning to, it had become true. Late that afternoon, Walter and Nate started checking the basement beneath the collapsed floor section. The stairs down were narrow and steep. Ranger followed close behind, carrying a flashlight beam across the walls with his movement. Dust floated thick in the air. The basement smelled like oil, rust, and old water damage. Nate crouched beside the ancient boiler system. "This thing belongs in a museum." Walter ran one hand across a cracked pipe. Still breathing, though. Barely. Further back, the basement opened into another corridor partially blocked by fallen shelving and concrete chunks. Ranger suddenly pushed ahead. Fast. "Ranger!" The dog disappeared around the corner. A loud crash echoed instantly. Then a sharp yelp. Walter's heart stopped. He moved faster than his body wanted to. Pain shot through his knee as he rounded the corner. Ranger stood trapped near a collapsed section of flooring where broken boards and metal piping had slid downward. One front paw pinned awkwardly beneath debris. Walter dropped beside him immediately. "Easy, easy, buddy." Ranger whined softly but stayed still. Nate shoved debris aside while Walter carefully freed the dog's leg. The paw came loose finally. Ranger limped hard at first but stayed standing. Walter checked the leg with shaking hands. No blood, no obvious break. Still. The fear hit him harder than expected, hard enough that Nate noticed. "He's okay," Nate said quietly. Walter nodded too quickly. Ranger leaned against him heavily for a second before limping toward the stairs. That was what scared Walter most. Not the injury. The trust. Back upstairs, Clara wrapped Ranger's paw carefully with an old scarf, while Noah sat beside him crying quietly. Walter stood near the stove, pretending to organize tools so nobody would notice his hands still shaking. Then Noah looked up at him and asked the question Walter had been avoiding all day. "They're not gonna make us leave, right?" Walter opened his mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Across the room, the inspection notice still sat on the table beside the cold coffee cups. 30 days. Outside, evening settled slowly over Hadley Ridge, and somewhere beneath the old jail, hidden behind fallen concrete and darkness, another locked room waited. Walter barely touched dinner. Clara noticed but didn't mention it. Nate did. "You keep staring at that basement like it insulted your mother." Walter sat at the old table, turning the inspection notice over in his hands. Floor collapse didn't happen by accident. Buildings fall apart. Not like that. Ranger rested near the stove with his injured paw stretched forward. The limp looked better already, but Walter still checked the dog every 20 minutes without realizing he was doing it. Noah noticed, though. "You worry about him a lot?" Walter grunted softly. "He's old. So are you." Clara nearly choked on her coffee, trying not to laugh. Even Walter cracked half a smile at that. It faded quickly, because the truth sat underneath it. They were both old, and old things broke easier. The next morning, Walter and Nate headed back into the basement, carrying pry bars, work lights, and enough caution to fill a church pew. Clara hated the idea immediately. That floor already collapsed once. Walter buttoned his coat slower than usual. "That's why we're careful. Careful still gets people hurt." Nate lifted one shoulder. "That's kind of America's whole thing." Walter snorted, despite himself. Ranger insisted on following them. "No," Walter said firmly. The dog stared at him. "Your leg needs rest." Ranger limped 3 steps forward anyway. Nate folded his arms. "I think you lost the vote." The basement felt colder today. Not temperature cold, unused cold. The kind places collected when people stopped existing inside them. Walter set up one work light near the collapsed floor, while Nate cleared broken shelving from the far wall. Dust drifted constantly through the flashlight beams. At the back of the corridor, they found it. A steel fire door nearly hidden behind old filing cabinets. Walter wiped grime from the surface with his sleeve. The faded lettering barely showed anymore. Temporary housing unit. Nate stared at the words. "Well," he said quietly, "that's interesting." Walter ran his hand slowly across the door. The lock mechanism had been removed years ago, but the frame had warped shut from moisture and time. Ranger sat beside the door immediately, watching it, waiting. Walter suddenly remembered the old intake forms. Veterans, shelter beds, requests for rooms near exits. This place had not simply been abandoned. It had been forgotten on purpose. Nate jammed the pry bar into the frame. Moment of truth. Metal groaned loudly through the basement. Walter flinched automatically at the sound. Not visibly, maybe, but enough that Nate noticed. "You good?" "Yeah." "Lie." The second shove finally broke the swollen frame loose. The door creaked inward slowly. Dust rolled out first, then silence. Walter stepped inside carefully. The room beyond wasn't what he expected. Not prison cells, not storage. A common room. Small kitchen against one wall. Rusted coffee urn still sitting on a counter. Folding chairs stacked neatly near the back. Military surplus blankets folded inside plastic bins. And photographs. Dozens of them, pinned to a corkboard coated in dust. Men sitting around tables, playing cards, eating soup, watching football on a tiny television. Old veterans mostly, gray-haired, tired-eyed, wearing thrift store jackets and work boots. One Polaroid showed 6 men standing outside the jail beside a burn pit. Walter recognized immediately. Same place Ranger had dug near the yard. Nate stepped beside him slowly. "This wasn't temporary shelter," he said. Walter looked around the room. It was home. The words came quietly, almost unwillingly. Ranger limped farther inside and stopped beside an old recliner near the corner. He sniffed the armrest once, then laid down beside it, like someone still belonged there. Walter stared at the chair a long moment. "Why would they shut this down?" Nate asked. Walter noticed another stack of boxes near the kitchen counter. County budget records, maintenance requests denied, heating failures, insurance liability concerns. No conspiracy, no dark secret, just money. Same story as always. Helping people lasted exactly as long as budgets did. Walter picked up another photo. This one showed a sheriff standing beside 3 veterans outside the building, sometime in the late 80s. One man held a handmade sign. "Open through winter." Walter swallowed hard, because suddenly the whole jail looked different in his mind. Not abandoned, interrupted. Nate opened one of the cabinets nearby. "Still got canned food from the Reagan administration. That's comforting." Walter barely heard him. His eyes stayed fixed on the photographs. These men had sat exactly where he now slept. Cooked meals here. Tried to survive winters here. Maybe fought the same nightmares here too. Ranger lifted his head toward Walter softly. And for one strange second, Walter felt less alone than he had in years. Back upstairs, Clara listened quietly while Walter explained what they found. Noah looked fascinated immediately. "So soldiers lived here." "Some veterans did," Walter corrected gently. "Why?" Nate answered from the stove. "Because sometimes people come home from war and nowhere else fits anymore." The room went quiet after that. Clara studied the old photographs spread across the table. One picture showed veterans decorating a tiny Christmas tree beside the same barred windows now, hanging with Walter's blankets. "That sheriff let them stay here?" Walter nodded slowly. "Looks like it." "So why stop?" Nobody answered, because everyone already knew. Money, politics, complaints. People caring until caring became inconvenient. That evening, Walter sat alone in the old common room downstairs, while Ranger slept beside the recliner. The work light cast long shadows across the dusty floor. Walter held one of the Polaroids carefully between rough fingers. A younger veteran smiled crookedly into the camera, holding a mug of coffee. Someone had written on the bottom in faded marker, "Still standing." Walter let out a slow breath. That was exactly what he'd said the first night he saw this place. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, the memories that came weren't all bad ones. Not firefights, not smoke, not screaming radios. Instead, he remembered barracks laughter at 2 in the morning, shared cigarettes behind supply tents, men too exhausted to pretend they were okay. Loneliness felt different when somebody else understood it without explanation. A sudden ringing upstairs pulled him back. Walter opened his eyes immediately. Cell phone. Nate answered it near the kitchen. A few seconds later, he appeared at the basement doorway looking uneasy. That was County Inspection Office. Walter stood slowly. "What now?" Nate hesitated. "They're moving up the inspection." Walter frowned. "Why?" Anonymous complaint got escalated. The old weight settled right back onto Walter's shoulders. "When?" Nate looked at him carefully. "Monday morning." Walter stared around the hidden room one more time. The photographs, the chairs, the forgotten lives stacked quietly beneath the jail. Then he looked toward Ranger. The dog watched him steadily from beside the recliner. Like he already knew what Walter was finally starting to understand. This place had been trying to save people long before Walter Hayes ever walked through the gate. Monday arrived too fast. Walter barely slept the night before inspection. Not because of nightmares this time, because of lists, smoke detectors, loose stair rail, the cracked outlet near the kitchen. The missing emergency light Nate kept complaining about. The old jail suddenly looked unfinished everywhere. Walter turned. Morning frost covered the windows when headlights climbed the ridge road. 3 vehicles this time, not one. Walter stood outside waiting with Ranger beside him. Clara hovered near the entrance holding Noah's shoulder. Nate muttered under his breath, "Well, that feels official." First out of the county sedan was Bill Mercer from Property Records. Behind him came a woman in a heavy gray coat, carrying a clipboard and a flashlight. The third man wore sheriff's department patches beneath his winter jacket. Tall, broad shoulders, weathered face, Sheriff Doyle. Walter noticed immediately that Doyle looked at Ranger before he looked at anything else. The shepherd stared back calmly. "Mr. Hayes," Bill said carefully. "This is Inspector Lena Ortiz. Sheriff Doyle's here because of occupancy concerns." Walter nodded once. No point pretending this was friendly. Inspector Ortiz looked up at the building slowly. "This place used to be Cedar County Detention Annex, far as I know, and now people are living here for winter." Her eyes drifted toward Clara and Noah near the doorway, then toward the smoke curling from the stovepipe, then toward the hand-built wooden door Walter had added to the front cell. "Let's take a look." The inspection started rough. Ortiz immediately noticed exposed wiring near the boiler room. Temporary patch. Walter nodded. Still dangerous. Then the stairwell. Then missing exit signs. Then the old heating lines. Every few minutes, she scribbled something else onto the clipboard while Walter felt another nail going into the coffin. Sheriff Doyle stayed quieter, mostly observing. At one point, he crouched near Ranger while Noah sat drawing at the kitchen table. The dog sniffed his hand once and relaxed. Doyle scratched behind Ranger's ears carefully. "Good animal," he murmured. "He likes you," Noah said. Doyle looked toward Walter. "That surprises me." Walter wasn't sure if it was a joke. Maybe it was. Maybe not. Inspector Ortiz stepped into the common area near the stove and paused. The room had changed a lot over the last few weeks. Blankets folded neatly, coffee heating on the burner, Noah's drawings taped near the wall. Clara had organized canned food onto shelves beside old intake paperwork from the basement, not polished, but lived in. Ortiz looked toward Clara. "How long have you stayed here?" Clara hesitated. Walter saw the fear cross her face immediately, like saying the wrong thing might get the whole place erased. "A little over a week," she answered carefully. "And you feel safe here?" That question landed differently. Clara looked toward Noah, sitting beside Ranger, then toward the cell room with the wooden door that locked from inside. "Yes," she said quietly, "safer than before." Ortiz wrote something down. Walter's stomach tightened harder. People with clipboards always made lives smaller. The inspection continued upstairs. Half the second floor remained untouched. Broken bars, empty cells, dust thick enough to leave footprints. Walter hated bringing them up there. It showed too clearly how little he'd actually fixed. Ortiz tested the loose handrail once. It shifted. She gave Walter a look over the top of her glasses. "Needs replacing." "Already on the list." "You have many lists," Walter almost answered. Didn't. Sheriff Doyle stopped near one of the upper windows, looking out across the snow-covered ridge. "Beautiful view," he said quietly. Walter shrugged. "Didn't notice at first. People usually don't when they're surviving." That surprised Walter enough to actually look at him. Doyle kept staring out the window. "2 tours Iraq," the sheriff said casually. "Took me 3 years before I could sleep without checking every door lock twice." Walter said nothing. Didn't have to. Doyle understood silence the way veterans did. Downstairs again, Nate showed Ortiz the electrical work they'd repaired over the weekend. "Most of it's stable now," he explained. "Still need proper grounding in 2 sections." Ortiz nodded. "You licensed?" Nate smirked faintly. "No, Mom. Just stubborn." Walter expected that answer to hurt them. Instead, Ortiz almost smiled. Almost. Then Ranger suddenly stood, head lifting toward the hallway leading to cell block C. Walter noticed immediately. So did the sheriff. The dog walked halfway down the corridor before stopping near the chained steel door. Sheriff Doyle followed slowly. "What's back there?" Walter exchanged a quick glance with Nate. Old cell block. Doyle studied the chained door a moment. Then the sheriff surprised everyone. "My uncle stayed here once." Walter frowned. "What?" Doyle nodded toward the door. "Back in the late 80s. After Vietnam." He rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "Sheriff back then opened part of the jail unofficially during winters." Walter felt the pieces clicking together. The photos, the intake forms, the burn pit. Doyle continued quietly. "County shut it down after funding dried up. Liability concerns. Folks complained about drifters." Ranger sat near the door calmly now, watching them all. Inspector Ortiz stepped closer. "There are still people complaining." Walter crossed his arms. "About what exactly?" "Transits. Safety issues. One caller claimed armed squatters." Noah looked up from the kitchen table immediately. Clara's face tightened. Walter's voice dropped lower. "Nobody here's armed." Doyle glanced toward Ranger. "Except him, maybe." That finally got a small laugh out of Noah. The tension eased just enough. Ortiz finished her notes near the front desk while snow drifted softly outside the broken gate. Walter stood waiting for the verdict with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Old familiar feeling, like waiting outside an office before hearing whether life got smaller again. Finally, Ortiz closed the clipboard. "Here's where we are, Mr. Hayes." Nobody moved. "You are not approved for permanent residential occupancy." Walter felt Clara stiffen behind him. "But," Ortiz continued, Given current weather conditions and the presence of a minor child, the county can issue a temporary winter occupancy permit. Walter blinked once. Not trust, shock. Ortiz pointed toward the paperwork. Conventional approval. 30 additional days. You'll need functioning smoke alarms in every occupied room, stabilized stair rails, proper carbon monoxide detectors, and a secondary marked exit route. Nate exhaled quietly beside him. Walter still didn't speak. Doyle folded his gloves into one hand. In plain English, Hayes, he looked around the room carefully. Nobody's shutting you down today. Noah grinned immediately. Clara closed her eyes for one brief second, like her knees almost gave out beneath her. Walter looked toward Ranger. The dog had already relaxed beside the stove again, like somehow he'd known before any of them. As the county vehicles prepared to leave, Sheriff Doyle paused near the entrance. "One more thing," he said. Walter waited. Doyle nodded toward the old jail around them. "You keep this place safe, people eventually stop calling it a prison." Then he glanced toward Ranger. "Dog's doing half the work already." The sheriff walked back through the snow toward his truck. Walter stood in the doorway, watching the vehicles disappear down Hadley Ridge. Behind him, the jail sounded different now. Not quiet, exactly. Occupied. Alive. And for the first time since losing everything, Walter realized he was no longer waiting to leave this place. He was trying to keep it. The next few days moved differently. Not easier, just fuller. Walter rebuilt the upstairs handrail with lumber Nate hauled up from Cedar Creek. Clara organized food shelves near the kitchen. Noah taped hand-drawn signs beside the room doors that read things like "Quiet after 9" and "Please knock." The old jail slowly stopped feeling temporary. That scared Walter more than he admitted, because temporary things hurt less when they disappeared. One afternoon, Ellie arrived with groceries in the back of her truck and stood staring at the new wooden doors Walter had built across the cells. "Well," she said softly, "look at this place." Walter shrugged from atop a ladder. "Still ugly. Ugly's not the same thing as hopeless." Ranger trotted over immediately to greet her. Ellie scratched behind his ears before lowering her voice toward Walter. "People in town are talking different now. That good or bad depends who you ask." Walter climbed carefully down the ladder. His knees hated ladders now. Ellie leaned against the table near the stove. "Some folks still think you're running a homeless camp. And the others? They think maybe somebody should've done this years ago." Walter didn't know what to do with that sentence. Before he could answer, the prepaid cell phone Nate had donated buzzed loudly from the counter. Nobody moved at first. Walter rarely got calls. The number on the screen showed Spokane, Washington. Something tightened immediately in his chest. He answered slower than necessary. "Yeah." Silence. Then a man's voice, older than Walter remembered. "Dad." Walter stared at the wall. Ranger lifted his head instantly from near the stove. "Ethan." The room went very still. Nate quietly guided Noah toward the upstairs rooms, while Clara pretended to organize canned goods 20 feet away. Nobody wanted to overhear. Everybody did, anyway. Ethan cleared his throat on the other end. "I saw an article online." Walter frowned. "Article? Small-town news thing. About veterans staying in an old jail." Walter looked toward Ellie. She winced slightly. "Cedar Creek Gazette posted something last week." Walter hadn't even known. Ethan continued awkwardly. "Somebody sent it to me." Walter sat down slowly at the table. The silence stretched too long again. Father and son both waiting for the other one to build a bridge. Neither very good at it. Finally, Ethan spoke first. "You look older." Walter almost laughed at the stupidity of the statement. "That's generally how time works." A small pause. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan laughed softly too. First real thing either of them had shared in years. Walter rubbed one rough hand across his jaw. How long's it been? 4 years, Ethan admitted quietly. Walter nodded to himself, felt longer. So, you really living in a prison? County says temporary occupancy structure. That sounds worse somehow. Walter glanced around the room while Clara quietly washed dishes nearby. The stove crackled softly. Ranger watched him carefully. It's not what you think, Walter said finally. Then what is it? Walter opened his mouth, stopped, because he honestly didn't know how to explain this place anymore. Not shelter, not home exactly, something in between. People needed somewhere warm, he answered at last. Another silence. Then Ethan asked the question Walter had expected eventually. You okay? Funny thing was, Walter didn't know anymore. A month ago the answer would been easy, no. Now, he looked toward Noah's drawings, taped crookedly beside the stove, toward Clara humming softly near the sink, toward Nate arguing with Ellie outside about whether old wiring or bad plumbing ruined more buildings, toward Ranger asleep by the doorway. I'm breathing, Walter answered quietly. Ethan exhaled hard through the phone. Dad, I should called sooner. Walter closed his eyes briefly. There it was, the thing underneath everything. Not apology exactly, but close enough to hurt. Yeah, Walter said softly. You probably should've. Neither man spoke after that for several seconds. Then Ethan cleared his throat again. I can send money. Walter's jaw tightened immediately. No, Dad, I said no. Pride rose too fast, too sharp. Same old wound. Ethan's voice hardened a little too. You're 78 years old, living in a condemned jail. Walter stood up suddenly and walked toward the hallway before the others could hear more. It's not condemned anymore. That's not the point. No, Walter snapped quietly. The point is I spent 4 years not hearing your voice, and now suddenly you want to buy your way back into the conversation. Dead silence. Walter instantly regretted it, but not enough to take it back. Finally, Ethan spoke again, softer now. I didn't know how to talk to you after Mom died. That landed clean through Walter's chest. Because neither had he. After his wife passed, both men had simply drifted into separate silences and stayed there. No fight, no dramatic betrayal, just distance growing mold over everything. Walter leaned one hand against the cold wall beside cell block C. I know, he said finally, and he meant it. The call ended awkwardly after that. No resolution, no perfect healing. Just two tired men reaching halfway across years of quiet and running out of words before they reached the middle. When Walter returned to the common room, Clara didn't ask questions. She just handed him coffee. That somehow felt worse. Outside, evening settled over Hadley Ridge again. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the gutters now. Winter loosening slightly. Ranger paced near the front entrance, restless and alert. Walter noticed immediately. What is it? The dog gave a short bark and scratched once at the door. Nate looked up from rewiring an outlet. Probably deer. But Ranger kept pacing. Faster now. Walter finally opened the door. Cold mountain air rushed inside. Darkness beyond the porch. Ranger bolted into it instantly. Ranger! The shepherd disappeared down the slope toward the tree line. Walter grabbed his coat immediately. Damn dog. I'll come with you, Nate said, already reaching for flashlights. The mountain at night felt enormous. Wind moving through pine trees sounded almost like distant voices. Walter's knee protested every step downhill through crusted snow. Ranger! He shouted again. No answer, just darkness. Nate swept his flashlight across the ridge. Maybe he caught an animal scent. He never runs this far. Walter heard the fear in his own voice before he could hide it. That scared him more, because suddenly he realized exactly how much of his life sat inside that dog. More than companionship, routine, trust. The last creature on earth who knew Walter completely and stayed anyway. An hour passed. Then two. The temperature dropped hard after midnight. Walter kept searching, ignoring the pain building in his chest and knees. At one point, Nate grabbed his arm firmly. "You need to slow down." Walter jerked free immediately. "I'm not leaving him out here." Nate stared at him carefully. "You think this is about the dog?" Walter looked ready to argue, then stopped. Because Nate was right. This wasn't just about Ranger disappearing into the mountains. It was about losing the last thing that made Walter feel anchored to the world. Near 2 in the morning, they climbed back toward the jail empty-handed. Walter's legs trembled from exhaustion now. The porch light glowed weakly through the dark. Clara waited at the doorway wrapped in a blanket, Noah asleep against her shoulder. Walter barely made it halfway up the steps before he heard it. Scratch, very soft, from the other side of the door. Walter froze. Then the scratching came again, soft, weak, coming from the other side of the door. Walter lunged forward faster than his knees wanted to move and pulled the entrance open hard enough for icy wind to burst inside. Ranger stumbled through immediately. Snow clung thick to his fur. One side of his shoulder was streaked with dirt and frozen slush. His injured paw dragged slightly worse than before. But he was alive. Walter dropped to one knee without thinking. "Jesus Christ, dog." Ranger pushed straight into him, exhausted but determined, tail hitting weakly against Walter's coat. Then Walter noticed something else. Someone stood just beyond the porch in the darkness. An older man, 70s maybe, thin winter jacket, no gloves, snow covering the shoulders of his coat. He looked disoriented more than dangerous. Ranger turned immediately back toward the man and barked once. Not warning, calling. Nate lifted his flashlight carefully. The man squinted against the beam. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "I think I got turned around." Walter stood slowly, one hand still resting on Ranger's neck. "You out here alone?" The man nodded once. Trucks slid off the road farther down the ridge. I started walking. He looked embarrassed suddenly. Didn't realize how far. Clara appeared behind them in the doorway. "Oh my God." The old man swayed slightly where he stood. Walter stepped aside immediately. "Get inside before you freeze." The man entered carefully, staring at the old jail around him with confusion. Ranger followed close beside him the entire way, almost escorting him. By the time coffee sat in the man's hands, everyone understood what had happened. Ranger hadn't run away. He'd found somebody, again. The old man introduced himself as Vernon Pike, retired rancher from 2 counties over. He'd taken a wrong mountain turn after visiting family and lost traction near the Ridge Road. "I heard barking," Vernon said quietly, warming his hands around the mug. "Thought maybe wolves at first." Noah grinned sleepily from the stairs. "That's Ranger." Vernon looked down at the shepherd stretched beside the stove. "Well, your dog probably saved me tonight." Walter glanced toward Ranger. The dog barely lifted his head now, exhaustion finally catching him. Walter rested one hand against the thick fur behind Ranger's ears. "Yeah," he said softly. "He's got a habit of doing that." Morning came slowly after that. Sunlight spilled across the old stone walls in pale gold streaks while snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof. For the first time in weeks, the jail felt warm before sunrise. Not physically, emotionally. People moved around the kitchen naturally now. Clara cooking eggs, Nate repairing a cabinet hinge, Noah feeding Ranger pieces of bacon under the table when he thought nobody noticed. Walter noticed, pretended not to. Sheriff Doyle arrived before noon after Vernon finally reached his family by phone. The sheriff listened quietly to the story while Ranger slept beside the stove, wrapped in Noah's blanket like an aging war hero. Doyle crouched beside the dog carefully. So he tracked him through the storm? Walter nodded. Found him almost a mile from here. Doyle scratched Ranger gently behind the ears. That's one hell of an animal. Ranger thumped his tail once without opening his eyes. Vernon's son arrived an hour later in a mud-covered truck. Big man, thick beard, worried sick. He hugged his father hard enough to nearly knock the old man sideways. Then he turned toward Walter and the others standing near the entrance. I don't know how to thank you. Walter shrugged automatically. Dog found him. The son looked toward Ranger. Still counts. Before leaving, Vernon paused near the doorway and looked slowly around the building. The cell doors, the stove, the coffee pot steaming beside old intake paperwork. This place, he hesitated, feels different than people describe it. Walter almost smiled. That's because most people only see the bars. After they left, Sheriff Doyle remained near the entrance longer than necessary. Finally, he pulled folded paperwork from inside his coat. Walter frowned immediately. What's that? Draft application for emergency seasonal shelter status. Walter blinked once. Shrugged slightly. County won't fund you. Don't get excited. He nodded toward the paperwork. But if you file under nonprofit emergency occupancy, they can stop treating this place like squatters hiding in a condemned building. Nate let out a low whistle from the kitchen. You serious? Temporarily serious, Doyle corrected. Seasonal permit only. Limited occupancy. Safety inspections continue. Walter stared at the forms in silence. Just a month ago, he'd been sleeping alone behind broken bars, trying not to freeze. Now a sheriff stood inside the same building, offering legal paperwork to keep it alive. Life turned strange fast. Clara stepped closer quietly. You should do it. Walter looked around the room. At Noah drawing another house near the stove. At Nate, fixing things without being asked. At Ranger asleep beside people instead of guarding against them. Then toward the hallway leading to Cell Block C, the old, forgotten shelter beneath the jail. Still standing, Walter took the paperwork slowly. I don't know how to run something like this. Sheriff Doyle smirked faintly. From what I've seen, you already are. The weeks that followed never became easy. The roof still leaked during heavy snow. The pipes groaned every morning. Money stayed tight enough that every grocery trip involved math. But the building changed. Smoke detectors appeared one by one. Nate wired emergency lights into the stairwell. Ellie started bringing leftover soup from the store cafe twice a week. Someone from town donated bunk mattresses. Another person dropped off children's books after hearing Noah lived there. Nobody called it a jail much anymore. Mostly people just called it the Ridge. One evening near the end of winter, Walter stood outside the entrance, watching sunset burn orange across the snowfields. Ranger sat beside him quietly. The shepherd's muzzle had gone whiter lately. Walter noticed things like that now. Inside the building came the sound of dishes clinking and Clara laughing at something Nate said too loudly. Human sounds. Home sounds. Walter looked down at Ranger. You know you ruined retirement for me. Ranger blinked slowly. Could spent my last years complaining in peace. The dog rested his head against Walter's leg. A pair of headlights climbed slowly up Hadley Ridge. Walter straightened slightly. Old instinct, but no fear this time. Just caution. An older couple stepped out of the car once it stopped near the gate. Both looked exhausted. The woman clutched a single suitcase. The man avoided eye contact entirely. Walter recognized the look immediately. the look of people trying very hard not to look abandoned. Ranger stood first. He walked slowly toward them through the snow. The woman hesitated when the shepherd approached. Then Ranger sniffed her hand once and leaned gently against her coat. The woman started crying almost immediately. Not loudly, just tired. Walter looked at the open doorway behind him. Warm light spilling out across the snow. Coffee smell drifting through the cold air. Voices inside. He thought about the first night he'd slept here alone, with his coat covering a broken window. Thought about the old photographs downstairs. About veterans who had once tried to keep this place alive before the world forgot them. Thought about how close he'd come to disappearing himself. Walter stepped forward and opened the entrance door wider. "There's coffee on the stove," he said quietly. The couple followed Ranger inside. Walter stayed on the porch one moment longer, watching light spill through the old jail windows onto the snow. Then he looked down the corridor. The bars were still there. The stone walls, too. But the doors now locked from the inside. And somewhere along the way, a place built to hold broken people had become the very thing that helped them heal. Walter smiled faintly to himself and closed the door against the winter night. Maybe that's what this story was really about, all along. Not the jail, not the snow, not even the $6. It was about what happens when somebody decides not to look away. Walter had almost disappeared into the kind of loneliness most people never notice until it happens to someone they love. An old veteran. No family nearby, no real home left. Just a dog that refused to leave his side. And somehow that loyalty changed everything. Ranger never cared whether Walter had money, status, or a perfect past. He stayed, through the cold, through the fear, through every locked door inside that old building, and inside Walter himself. And little by little, other people stayed too. That's the part worth remembering. Sometimes people don't need saving speeches. Sometimes they just need a light on somewhere, a warm cup of coffee, and a door that stays open long enough for them to walk through it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you have opened that door for strangers in the middle of winter? Type 1 for yes. Type 0 for no. And if you enjoy quiet stories about loyalty, healing, second chances, and the bond between people and dogs, you're welcome to stay for the next one. There's always another light waiting somewhere down the road.